Myanmar's human rights record is coming under scrutiny again. A court has sentenced 2 journalists from the Reuters news agency to 7 years in jail. The 2 were reporting on Myanmar's brutal crackdown on Rohingya Muslims. They were convicted of possessing illegal secret documents. The reporters say the charges are false and they were framed. And they say the arrest was done to silence their reporting and intimidate the press. Now, Canada's special envoy to Myanmar, Bob Rae, has already reacted to the sentencing on Twitter. He calls the conviction a travesty and says the government of Myanmar will be judged severely for it. And he joins me now from Portland, Ontario. Good morning to you, Mr. Rae.
Morning, Arthi.
So first, I do want to get your reaction to this news. I know that on Twitter, for example, you called it a travesty.
Well, it is a travesty. I mean, they're convicted of breaking the Official Secrets Act. And they were given the secrets by the police. I mean, this is a classic example of people being entrapped. And the 2 journalists were simply covering a story which we know is true, which is that there was a massacre that occurred that was carried out by the security forces in Myanmar, a massacre in a village involving at least 10 members of the Rohingya community. So the trial has been a kind of show trial, but it actually fell apart. The evidence was clear that it was the authorities themselves who gave the 2 journalists the documents, and then they arrested them for having the documents in their possession. So it's a preposterous charge, and the idea that a judge would convict people, I think, raises the most serious questions about the independence of the judiciary. About how the charges were brought in the first place, and the involvement of the military in the entire affair. So it's a very troubling situation indeed.
And we're certainly also hearing some questions about the motivation behind these convictions. For example, Human Rights Watch is saying that this is an effort just to intimidate journalists from reporting on what is happening in Myanmar. And the 2 journalists, in fact, said after the sentence that they're not exactly shocked. So what does that tell you, or what does that indicate about what exactly is happening in Myanmar right now, particularly about those reporting on the Rohingya crisis?
Well, we need to understand that although there's been a process, an evolution in Myanmar, the military still have complete control over the security, over the Ministry of the Interior, over all the border areas, and over the entire defense establishment of the country. So it's essentially a military dictatorship with a democratic front, and I think that's what's coming apart at the seams, and that's why I think a lot of countries are raising the most serious issues about the administration of justice, about the possibilities of a fair trial inside Myanmar in a circumstance like this. And I think it does raise very serious questions for all of those people who had high hopes for the evolution of democracy in Myanmar.
Now, after your return from Myanmar and from assessing the situation there were 4 key areas, in fact, where you had really specifically looked at some recommendations. And some of those key areas were the political situation in Myanmar itself. You called it a challenging situation. And another area was accountability that you said countries need to focus on. So what can Canada do in its role here in order to make sure that accountability is something that is being had here when we come to the situation where journalists are being convicted and it appears to be a fear tactic?
Well, we need to put what's happening in the context of the overall tragedy, which is there's 1 million refugees living in Bangladesh. We still don't have the necessary process for peace and justice in Myanmar, and we're still working on the issue of accountability for those responsible for what's taken place. I was in New York last week at the UN, where we heard reports about the conditions in the refugee camps, which are very, very bad. And there will be further meetings in Geneva in 2 weeks' time, where the final and full report of the UN fact-finding mission will become public. And that, I think, will make it clear to people just how daunting the challenges are of holding people accountable for what's taken place. What's the jailing of these 2 journalists, the conviction of these 2 journalists, obviously is intended to muzzle political dissent in the country and to stop people from reporting the truth on what is happening. But I think we all recognize that in today's world, this isn't going to work. The truth will come out. The truth is coming out, and it will continue to come out. And it's something that Canada has to be at the forefront of the efforts to make sure those responsible are, in fact, held accountable.
And now, Mr. Ray, just one final very quick question as we are quickly running out of time. But I did want to ask, you are heading back in October. Do you intend on raising this issue when you head back there?
Of course, if I'm allowed into the country, of course I'll be raising this issue. It's a very, very serious indication of how big the challenges are to create a greater degree of democracy and freedom of speech inside Myanmar.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Mr. Ray. We appreciate it. That is Bob Ray. He is the special envoy to Myanmar, and he joined us from Portland, Ontario.